And I started thinking about little kids in the 16th century. Those kids had a bigger vocabulary than I have now as an adult because they were exposed to that language, which means I am not smart enough to read fairy tales to 16th century children. I'd be lost in the kids section at the library in the 16th century. Can you imagine what their books were like? It'd be like, in time past, or not long ago, there lived pigs in stature little and number 3, who, being of an age both entitled and inspired to seek their fortune, did set about to do thusly. When they had travelled a distance, pig number first spake, saying, "Hearken, brethren, heed this tempestuous realm. Tarry we long from hearth and home, we shall fare, I fear, not well."
So, John, welcome to the program. Very glad to have you with us. John is a wonderful guy. I'm not done talking yet. You have to wait until I'm done talking for you to
I'm
talk.
not used to this, Hans.
So John has a podcast that he does. Starving Comedians Podcast is the name, right?
The Starving Comics Quarantine Show.
Okay, I was sort of close. Starving Comics Quarantine Show. I was on it a couple times. That's why I remembered exactly what the name of the show was.
It obviously meant a lot to you to be on that show.
It did. No, I had a really great time. And but so you started doing that basically because during COVID and all that stuff, for some odd reason, comedy clubs were not deemed essential businesses.
That's essentially, what it was. I was not essential, and so I had to do something to basically occupy my time. I'm still not making any money doing the show. It's really difficult to make money, as you know, with some sort of online thing. But yeah, we started doing the show basically to keep from going insane when we spent a year and a half off the road.
How long have you been a stand-up comedian?
Full-time since 2000. And I've been doing stand-up on a part-time basis since 1990.
All right. So one of the things I wanted to start off asking is one of the ways in which I think pastors and comedians are similar is that people always expect there to be a really good story for how you got into it, right? So when people say to me, "Oh, how did you know you wanted to be a pastor?" And I know they want some story like, "I was out fishing upon the sea and a great storm came upon the waters and it tossed the boat to and fro and I fell into the icy deep. And then I felt this hand made of pure light, pull me out from the deep and said, 'You, Hans Feeney, you must go to Concordia Theological Seminary and be a pastor.'" And they'd go, "Is that why you're a pastor?" And I go, "Yeah, kind of. That's a little bit of it. That was part of it." But most pastors I know don't have a particularly good story. And I'm a little suspicious of guys that do. Most of the time for pastors, the way I would describe it is it's a little bit like if having to go home to turn off the stove because you remember that you left the stove on. You're not excited about it, but it has to be done. And you have the key to the house and you can get in and do the thing. So that's the sort of the best story that a lot of people get. Or it starts off with a real tragic, Batman backstory, right? So like, why did you become a pastor? And you go, "Well, my parents died. And
they were killed in an alley after the theater."
Right. Yeah. So do you have a good story to that? Do you find that comedians, it's kind of that same thing, like where people expect you to have a really funny story for how you knew you were funny and then it's inevitably a disappointment?
Well, you are the first pastor who I have heard talk about your calling in such an ordinary term. I mean, most of the time when pastors it is a story where God came to me in a dream and I answered the calling. The comedy is not really. It doesn't have those same, I think, prestigious underpinning. Most of the time people want to know how I learned to do it. The misconception that I normally deal with is where did you go to learn it? They think there's some sort of a monastery out somewhere that all people go to learn to be funny. How I got into it was I just have always loved it from the time I was a kid. If I'm flipping channels, I would stop and watch stand-up comedians. And so I was I was fascinated by it. I grew up in an environment where when I talked, adults would laugh. I made people laugh when I talked. And so I was watching comedy one night with my wife, and I turned to her and I said, I'm as funny as this guy. This guy's, on television, and I'm as funny as him. She goes, yeah, I think you're funnier than him. And I thought, I wonder how you do this.
Sweet, supportive wife.
She's so nice. Yeah. And she's,
and then she ruined your life by encouraging you.
By encouraging me to do it. Right.
Yeah. It's all her fault.
Well, I never expected to be any good at it. I just thought that I never intended to do it as a hobby. So I never had a calling, like pastors get, where it's like, okay, you come to a crossroads. Now you're either gonna follow this pastorship, or you're gonna, get a day job. Mine was very much, I can do both, because I live close enough to Indianapolis that I could go down to the comedy clubs after work and do open mics, and that's what I did. And I did that for a few years. Just as a hobby, because it was fun. There's a whole community at the open mic, or there was when I was doing it in the 90s. And the same guys would come in, and you would bring your notebooks and you would try out your bits, and some of them would work, and you would help each other. So it was almost like a church in some ways. There's a fellowship among comedians, and I just enjoyed it. And so I hung around because it was a hobby.
So for anyone who's watching this, if you have never gone to an open mic night, a comedy open mic night, I cannot recommend it enough, because one of two things will happen. Either you'll see a young John Branyan who's good, and they'll be hilarious, and you'll enjoy the fact that you went, or they will be so horrifyingly bad that it's even better than if they're good. I mean, if you can handle the cringe, watching someone, just because you'll get people whose friends have told them that they were funny,
right,
and then they think that translates into going on stage and being funny, where the expectation is much higher. It's sort of like when you take a guy who likes to pray and they go, "Oh, you should be a pastor," and then they forgot to find out whether or not he can communicate with people other than God.
Right.
So I would say,
right,
the way you were describing getting started in comedy sounds to me like how I imagine you learn how to ski jump, which is that you try it and then you die. But in comedy, you somehow get to try it again. I've never been able to figure that out with ski jumping. Like, how do you go? I get how you go from being really good to being Olympic level.
That's a great question.
I don't understand how you go from never having ski jumped to ski jumping without breaking every bone in your body dying, and reorganizing your internal organs.
Surely their first attempt at ski jumping is not off of that, 100-foot jump.
Right.
Surely there's incremental, increases, right?
Right, but I've seen incremental diving boards. I've never seen an incremental ski jump.
Right.
So they have to exist, but there's no evidence for them. We're being like evolutionists here, where we're insisting that there's the missing link, that there's no actual physical evidence for.
We're looking for the interim species of ski jump. Yeah.
Right.
Well,
yeah.
Well, it's true that that mostly you bomb when you start out. Even, you're saying that you can see a young John Branyan who's good. Young John Branyan was not any good. That's the whole point. You go and you're just not good, because even if you're a funny person, there's things that you have to do when you go on stage and stand up in front of a group of strangers who don't know you. There's certain things that have to take place in order for them to come aboard your train. And so, it's similar to delivering a sermon. There's things that you're communicating with people, right, like you do when you have a conversation, but preaching a sermon is not like having a conversation. There's things that you have to do differently because you're talking to a group of people.
The recently departed and sainted Norm Macdonald, who's a comedian I love very dearly, I'm sure you did as well. Yep. He has, in the past few years, had said that his problem with a lot of contemporary comedians is that they'd rather get applause than laughter. So in other words, that comedy is, his assertion, and I would certainly agree with this, that comedy is bad, essentially, when comedians would rather be preachers than comedians. but I would say there's an equally, if not worse, if not more terrible thing of when pastors and preachers want to be comedians. So in your experience as a guy, so you're a lifelong Christian. Are you a lifelong Christian? Yeah. So
Mhm.
lifelong Christian.
I'm not a Lutheran yet.
Well, we're working on that.
I know.
But you've gone to a lot of churches and you've been in a lot of stand-up clubs.
Yep.
What's worse, comedians preaching from the stage or pastors ripping off terrible jokes from the pulpit?
Comedians preaching from stage, far and away, is worse than pastors telling terrible jokes, because there's something sort of endearing about a pastor who can't tell a joke. And it's kind of okay, and that in and of itself becomes sort of the punchline. I mean, you've got a guy who's up there, everybody loves him. He visits them in the hospital, and he's just their pastor. And so it's kind of like when dad tells a terrible joke.
Mm.
You don't get on his case for that. That's what dads do. And that's what some pastors do. They just can't tell a joke. And everybody knows that they can't tell a joke. And some of the biggest laughs that I've had in the congregation have been at the obviously, botched joke. Because a comic, a lot of times pastors don't even understand what the punchline is or why it's funny. They're just reciting something that they read out of a book. Right. And that to me is hilarious. I mean, to tell a joke, because pastor is supposed to insert humor here into the sermon, and he has no idea what's funny about it or why the punchline works. It's hilarious.
See, I can tell that you're the comedian and I'm the pastor, not only because I already knew that, but because I think pastors telling terrible jokes from the pulpit is so much worse, because it sucks the life out of the room. Because when you have to give someone a laugh that they don't earn, it's exhausting, and then that depletes the energy that they have to hear the stuff that you should actually.
Do you think people feel obliged to laugh if they're?
Yeah.
You think they do?
Have you ever been to a church where a pastor's told a terrible joke that would have utterly died in a comedy club, and then he gets like that, that chuckle, like the actual audible version of when people type LOL to you, where they kind of go, ha, ha, and then just to sort of get it over with. Why do you think though that in comedy, the penchant for turning comedy into preaching, why has that happened? It's a much more, I feel like it's a more modern innovation. And there have been kind of seeds of it here and there, throughout comedy history. But if you look at late night talk shows now, they're all activists with jokes rather than doing real comedy. Yeah.
It's funny that I was just talking to Jeff Allen about that this afternoon. And I think it's because the culture now that has come up in the last even 10 years, the youngsters that are coming up now all have this inflated idea about their own opinions and their own perspectives. And for the most part, the comedians who are not preaching the gospel. They're not interested they're not interested in holding Christ up above themselves. What they're doing is they're putting their own, they're putting themselves basically up on the stage. I'm smarter than you. I've got more insight than everybody else. I know more than the politicians. I know more than everybody. And so they have the mistaken idea that the rest of us are interested in their perspectives. The number of Hollywood celebrities and sports celebrities who go onto Twitter and social media and talk about politics and cultural things as if that's the reason that we're following them.
Yeah, one of the things that's weird to me about the politicization of non-political entities with sports and comedy and a whole host of other things is from a Lutheran standpoint, where Lutherans like to talk about the doctrine of vocation a lot. And, basically what place has God put you in your life, and whom has he called you to serve, and what gifts and abilities has he given you to serve your neighbor? And so while there are divinely established vocation. So, husband, father, mother, sister, child, pastor, etc. But there are also a lot of, kind of man-made vocations that are still very godly, and when they're fulfilled faithfully. And if God has given you the ability to entertain someone and let someone kind of step away from the sorrow and misery of the world, to me, that in many ways, that's a higher vocation than the guy who has to talk to you about stuff that makes you sad or angry, So that's what's so strange to me, is that it seems to me that whether it's comedians or athletes, they feel like, well, what I'm doing isn't important enough in and of itself. So in order to make it important, in order to make it matter, I have to talk about this stuff. And it's just such a misguided thing to me, because it's like, you've been given something that's so much better. It would be like if a guy were to, constantly go on mission trips, short-term mission trips, instead of spending time with his family, because he goes, oh, well, I don't feel like I'm doing anything important, when I hang out with my kids and play board games with them. And you go, no, that's actually a much more important task than the one that you're taking upon yourself. That's not really a part of the thing that you're doing. Right. Now, going back to the idea of you being a Christian who is a stand-up comedian, there is obviously, for folks who don't follow stand-up comedy, basically, you'll find typical stand-up comedy clubs where it's kind of anything goes, no holds barred type of stuff. And then you'll oftentimes find Christian comics sort of coalesce around, it's not so much the Christian circuit, but they somehow find a way to play to audiences that are predominantly Christian. How has that worked out for you in your career? How much of that of you being a comedian how much do you see yourself as a Christian comedian versus a comedian who is a Christian?
Yeah, very much in category B, a comedian who happens to be a Christian. I never wanted to be, I never wanted Christian to be the thing that I was pushing. I wanted to be able to go into a comedy club and stand on that stage in front of a hostile audience. The difference between a church audience and a comedy club audience is a comedy club audience doesn't feel like they owe you any respect or love.
Right.
And a church audience does. A church audience, you can go up there and be terrible, and they are still going to applaud, and they're still going to invite you to stay afterwards and eat cake with them.
That happens with preaching too.
Yeah, exactly. And I knew that. I grew up in church.
They'll be nice to you. Yeah.
Yep. I grew up in church. And so I knew that. I knew that no matter how awful it is, the church people are going to tell you that it was wonderful, and they're happy that you came. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want that. I wanted to be able to stand up in a comedy club and have those people go, okay, well, this guy was funny. And that was always my goal. But I drew a line early on. I said, I'm not going to do any material that I can't also do in church, in front of those people, because I didn't want to do something that I wouldn't be proud of if I found out that, my church friends were going to come to a show, and they often did. And so a weird thing has happened. I've been doing this long enough now that I've lived through the shift that's taken place. And it used to be that you went to a comedy club and, as you said, anything goes. And it was just, you never knew what you were going to hear. And some of it was vulgar, and some of it was crass, and some of it was hilarious, and some of it was both. But anymore in the comedy club now, it's basically populated with chickens. It's populated by people who are terrified that they are going to offend. They're going to offend somebody on race. They're going to offend somebody, a gay person. They're going to offend a woman. There are a whole bunch of groups out there that you will get into trouble if you offend them. And so the jokes, it's not anything goes anymore. Mm-hmm. It's very much, there's a channel that you have to walk in, and it's getting narrower and narrower and narrower. You can't make fun of anybody anymore. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the church, not all churches, but some of the churches, you actually do have more freedom to make fun of things than you have in the comedy clubs. And the unfortunate thing, this is what I was talking with Jeff about, the unfortunate thing is that there's not much difference anymore between the sensibilities and the ideologies in the church and the ideologies outside the church. It's become very homogenized. The church people are offended about the stuff that they've always been offended about. And now the people outside the church are offended about the same stuff that the church people have been offended about for a couple of decades. And it's weird to be a person who's trying to make jokes in this environment, because now everybody's mad at you. Right. Even the people who used to kind of be on your side are mad at you now because you've offended the gay people or the transsexual people or the people of color. Mm-hmm. You have offended them by making a joke about them. Mm-hmm. And that's the situation. And my take on that is that's not a reason to back down. That's not a reason to pull away. That's a reason for Christian people to sharpen their sense of humor, to get better at understanding, first of all, that God gave us comedy. We didn't make it up ourselves. God put humor in the universe and then gave us a sense of humor so that we could detect it. And a lot of people get offended because they say, well, that was a bad joke. That was what you said wasn't funny. It's like, I don't determine what's funny. God determines what's funny. And if you don't think that what I said was funny, well, then you have to take that up with God, not me, because he's the one that decides what's funny.
It is. Well, that's one of the things that is interesting to me at kind of a gut level with comedy, is that despite the fact that comedy has become a profession for a lot of comedians, so a lot of comedians are avowed atheists. To me, comedy doesn't work without just sort of deep in there a presupposition that there is a God who created the universe to be good and to be ordered properly. Because the source of basically all comedy is, this thing is weird. It doesn't work the way that it should work, and I'm pointing out how that's funny. So you have a bit where you talk about the idea of marriage is just so bizarre because men and women are wired so completely differently. And God says, here's this lady that you have nothing in common with and you don't communicate the same way. Figure it out, right? Now,
you're going to spend the rest of your lives together. That's my idea. It was a joke. It had to be a joke.
Right. But it's born from the observation that there is tension between men and women. And that, as from a Christian perspective, obviously that tension comes from the fall. I mean, you can even see this in God saying to Eve, part of her curse is your desire shall be for your husband and he shall rule over you.
Right.
So there is something deeply theistic, even if it doesn't bring you all the way to the cross, obviously, but there is something in it that things are funny when they're out of place, when they're not working, when they're unexpected. One of the other things that's weird to me about the sensitivity of audiences is that when you observe oddities about things, it's because you love those things and have been paying attention to them, So if you listen to, Steve Harvey talk about, growing up in the Black church, right now, that it clearly, when you listen to his comedy, it comes from a place of profound affection where he actually loved these women. But because you love them, you notice the things that are weird about them, and so you joke about it. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, is the strange thing about the sensitivity of audiences, is that if it seems that you're picking on people, probably more often than not, what's actually happening is that you're loving people and you're close to people and you're noticing these things, and yet the desire to be offended is so great that it trumps being able to see that.
I can tell by listening to a comedian's material whether or not he's had any relationship with the church. I can tell whether or not there's any sort of religious context in his past. I'm not saying I can determine whether or not they're Christian,
right?
but I can tell by the stuff that they talk about. Now, sometimes they will still ladle it, with profanity. But there is, like you were saying, there's a cynicism in the non-believers that I can just detect.
Right.
And people who are of a certain faith will talk about their church, for example, and they may be making fun of it, and they may be riffing on it, and they may even be sprinkling swear words throughout. But you can just tell that there's not that anger and that seething cynicism and discontentment is not there. Right. It's something else.
Yeah, I think when you look at kind of going back to that idea that humor is recognizing the absurdity of the world being out of joint, basically. And there's really two responses to recognizing that out of jointness. There's the laughter of joy, which Christians ought to have, which is basically, look at the mess the devil has made of this world. What a pathetic loser. He can't actually win, but this is, kind of what he's trying to do. I described this the other day as when the devil attacks you, it's like for young guys will get this. It's like if you're playing Madden with your buddy and you're down 21 points with 15 seconds left, and you just want to cause as much chaos as you can before the end of the game because you're just mad about losing. So you keep running off sides before the start of the play, and then you tackle his quarterback, and then you keep saying you won't do it again, and then you do it again 15 times in a row. That's the devil attacking us. He's already lost. All he can kind of do now, he knows his time is short, as the book of Revelation says. He can just kind of try to muck things up until Christ returns.
Just be as annoying as possible for the next 15 seconds.
Right. So that's the joy that Christians have, is that sin has been conquered, and so we have the right to laugh at it. All right. So one final question for you. This is something I think I could use your help on. So one of the things pastors frequently experience is you go into the office, you go to seminary, you get ordained, you become a pastor. If you're a Lutheran like me, you're oftentimes walking around in the clerical collar, and people meet you and they say, "Are you a pastor?" And you say, "Yes." And they say, "Oh, that's great. I've just been reading the greatest book by Joel Osteen or some other awful heretic," right? And I have this crisis where on the one hand, I go, I'm not the same as that, and I'm insulted that you think I am, and what you like is terrible, and you need to change everything about the way that you digest and ingest the word. You're bad, and I'm angry at you for trying to be nice to me by telling me that you like someone who's similar to what I do. And I know this happens to comedians all the time, right? Where there are some really hack comedians out there. Have you experienced this where people come up to you, they find out you're a comedian, and they go, "Oh, you're a comedian? Oh, my husband and I were just in Las Vegas, and we just saw insert name of horrible hack comedian here." How do you respond to that without being a raging jerk and at the same time not surrendering your dignity by just letting them compare you to someone who makes you want to cry?
Well, I'm not concerned with whether or not I come across as a raging jerk.
Okay. That's what I need to do then. Yeah. There's my problem right there.
Well, and I'm partially kidding, but partially not. There's another aspect to comedy that is overlooked in our culture, and I'm including the church culture, and that is that comedy makes you bulletproof to humiliation, harassment, laughter that is directed at you, even if it's mean-spirited laughter. When you have developed a sense of humor to a certain level, not only are you able to make other people laugh, but the laughter of people, the ridicule, the mockery, the stupidity of those people, the offendedness of those people doesn't affect you. And there are going to be some people who are not at this level yet who are going to say that that's callous and it's unloving, but it's not, because when you are, if I was to make it my job to not offend America's most sensitive people, then I would not be able to do what I do.
Mm.
And what I do is important because I've gotten letters over the years from people who have said, "Oh, you have no idea how much it meant to me to be able to just come and laugh." And it wasn't angry, and you didn't make fun of anybody, and we just laughed for an hour, and it meant so much to me. My so-and-so passed away, or I just went through a divorce, all of the tragedy that people are going through. If I was up on stage and I was worried about what people are going through, oh my gosh, what if there's a divorced person, and I'm talking about marriage, and that's really going to be hard for a divorced person. And if I worried about all of that stuff, I would not be able to speak.
Mm.
And so you have to kind of get to the point where doctors get, when they're doing surgery. If they were overwhelmed by the wounds and the blood, they wouldn't be able to do their job.
Right.
And so there's a certain, and I think pastors have to be this way too.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
In order to speak to the people who are hurting, you can't get down and hurt with them. And oftentimes that is going to be perceived as you don't care, or you're cold-hearted, or you have no emotion, when actually it's the opposite. It is, I've taken control of my emotions.
Mm.
And the fact that you're offended by what I said, I understand that, but it's not going to change anything.
Right.
Because it's because I'm not wrong. Just because you're offended doesn't mean that I'm wrong. And my response to those people who would say, well, you're like so-and-so, it would probably be something like, well, I'm different in that I'm actually funny, and he's a no good hack. But other than that, you're right.
I'm going to try that. Yeah. So, I have had people throughout the years that they don't, it's out of innocence, but they'll come up and say, "Oh, Lutheran. Oh, I'm Presbyterian. We're basically the same." And then I go, "Nah, we're not the same. Let me tell you why you're wrong, and why your pastor stinks."
Well, we both have noses. That's true. But,
yeah. Right.
But that's
but I do think though that, and again, to kind of tidy this up on the end here, this is another area where I see a lot of similarities between comedy and preaching. Is that in preaching, you're not concerned, you shouldn't be concerned with whether your words are beneficially received. Now, you should, of course, not go out of your way to offend people, and you should be conscious of the fact that you can speak the truth in such a way that it's not kind of dripping in the type of hyperbole that's going to make people not listen to you. But at the same time, your goal, your job as a pastor is to preach what's true. And if it's received well, great, and praise be to the Holy Spirit. And if it's not, then you pray that the Holy Spirit will eventually prepare those ears to hear it. This is why, going back to Norm Macdonald, this is why I like having a comedian come on my interview show and then praising another comedian.
I like that too.
Throughout the whole time.
And it happens almost every time I do an interview. We end up talking about other comedians who are better than me. So I'm used to that. Yeah.
Well, three greatest stand-up comedians of all time, of course, Norm Macdonald, John Branyan, and of course, Gallagher. Those are your those are your top three. No, but Norm Macdonald used to. The thing that was so great about Norm Macdonald was he believed in the joke, and if the joke was funny, it didn't matter to him at all if other people didn't laugh at him. In fact, that would oftentimes make it funnier for him, was the fact that other people didn't find it funny. If the material is good, then say it. And it's amazing to watch now. You go back and you watch those old Weekend Update things that he was anchoring, and he's got so many jokes that just bomb with the audience, but are the funniest things you've ever heard. And so you just sort of recognize that what matters is what I'm saying true?
Right.
Am I fulfilling my task up here speaking to these people? So now, before we officially close, promote yourself. Tell us where we can find your stuff. Are you going back on? You doing any stand-up gigs anytime soon? What's going on with all that?
I have a few. People are. I don't know. People are reluctant to book event because everything is so, random. You invest in renting a place and you sell some tickets and you put some advertising out and you book a comedian. And then 2 weeks before the event, the governor decides, we're going to lock down again because of COVID. And so people are really tentative about booking shows, and I understand that. So I've been doing more stuff online, and you can find me at johnbranyan.com. It's the best place. There's no O's in Branyan. It's Branyan.
I'll superimpose it there underneath you. So, and then I'll spell it wrong to get people to the wrong website.
Then we've got and I've got a podcast. And that's, you can get to that on the website too. It's a Comedian Next Door. And we talk about the same sort of stuff that we kind of talked about tonight. I think that comedy is a weapon. And I think that we need to do a better job of learning how to wield that weapon, because it'll make not only our lives better, but it will enrich the lives of everybody around us. And so the podcast is about all things comedy, and it's irreverent, and we make fun of everything. And the reason we do that is because, as you said earlier, everything can be made fun of because things are a little out of joint, things are a little out of whack. But at the end of the day, or at the end of time, we're going to be fine. So we can laugh at all of it. And
you have a couple of books that we can buy?
I do. I have a book that's the Three Little Pigs. It's in a book form. And I have, gosh, I didn't even know that this was over here. My most recent book is Life is Hardy Har Hard. And
I don't feel like, I haven't read the book, and I should, but I don't feel like it's going to live up to that title. That's a great title.
Life is Hardy Har Hard. It basically, this is a book about comedy, and it's probably not for you. It's full of sarcastic taunts and insults. It is astonishingly condescending. It was written by a professional comedian with no regard for manners or civil dialogue. You'll find something offensive in every single chapter, and the author refuses in advance to apologize for upsetting you. And so basically it's the answer to the question that I got all the time, which is, how do you think of material? And so I explain how I think of material, and then I weave into that the importance of having a sharp sense of humor to keep from being killed out in culture. We've got so much anti-bullying stuff that's going on, and it's driving me insane. I mean, teach kids not to bully. Teach kids not to bully. Well, of course, teach kids not to bully. But if you're sending your kids to school and you're yelling, "Don't bully my child," that's a little bit like sending them into combat without a vest, and saying, "Don't shoot this person. He's not wearing a vest." And I say that what we should do is teach people to be bully proof, and then the bullies can do their best, and it's not gonna hurt.
All right. Well, thank you so much to my guest, John Branyan, for being here. Please check out his material, and please be here for our next episode, where I will interview someone who's not Tony Dungy. Finally, John, one more question for you. Where do you get your ideas from? John?